everybody, this is Glen Mowrer, and I'm here today on the Next Step TVSB, starting our fall 2014 season. And we're going to go on and talk about local and other liberal political issues of sometimes of specific focus to Santa Barbara and sometimes more general. And one of the things we've done over the last year or so are a series I call American Politics. And we've had different guests on who discuss aspects of the American political scene that aren't part of the two-party system, the traditional, what so many people think is all American politics is about. And one of those subjects that we're going to talk about today is the Occupy movement. And we're really honored to have with us today William Y. Hyde. William is quite a long-time activist in the Occupy movement. By education, he has a degree in history, political science, history, and advanced work in other classes. He's worked for politicians over the years, Congress people, and he tells me they were mostly conservatives as he was getting the lay of the land, and other things. But he's been involved with the actual Occupy movement. Mm-hmm. So let's talk to William a bit about what he's got to say. William, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about the Occupy movement is that it doesn't seem to have specific agendas, doesn't have a demand agenda. Right. So tell us, how does that work in terms of effectiveness? Is it a problem that is causing people frustration, or does it help you accomplish the goal of whatever the goal of Occupy is?
Well, it's one of the strengths and also one of the major weaknesses of the movement, and the fact that it's leaderless, non-hierarchical, it's transparent, and has no demands. Now, the reason that it is these things is because leaders can be bought. If you have a list of demands, you can be co-opted by a political party. The movement is not a political party, was never structured to be a political party, was never created to emerge as a political party. So, of course, if it's non-hierarchical and leaderless, it's essentially saying to people in the movement, you're on your own. Now, what is the movement? What's the purpose of the movement? The purpose of the movement, and by the way, no one speaks for the movement. No one speaks for the movement.
To the degree that I may have implied that you speak for the movement, right. I apologize.
So the thing about the movement is that what it does is raise awareness. Now, there are a multitude of issues that this country, or for that matter, this world faces. You talk about global climate change, you can talk about the militarization of the police, you can talk about the corporatization of governments, you can talk about fracking, you can talk about the mortgage fraud going on. I mean, just pick a topic. Our political parties in America today they're incapable of dealing with these problems because they're in the back pockets of large corporations. Whereas the Occupy movement, from its very inception, realized if you choose a leader, that leader can be bought. If you have a list of demands, or if you have a series of issues, those can be co-opted, changed, mutated. Just if you look at the Republican platform or the Democratic platform, those things during the process of elections gets transformed and turns into whatever. So the strength of the Occupy movement is that it is non-structured, but its weakness is that people look for leaders, they're not there. People look for spokesmen or spokespeople, they're really not there. Because the purpose of the movement is to raise awareness. And so when we talk about if you want to, we can talk about the history of the movement, and we can talk about how it's evolved or changed, but yeah, that's it.
Well, I think that, some people have said, and I don't mean this pejoratively at all, I don't think it's a pejorative term, but it's more of an anarchist movement in a sense that it doesn't have leadership, as you said, and it doesn't have a list of agenda items. It doesn't say our platform or our manifesto.
That's right.
But the issue I think that causes frustration, and other people have said, maybe I'll stop for a moment and go to this, but this question I've asked for you. Mm-hmm. I've heard people say that one of the problems with the Occupy movement is that it's basically an urban movement, that it's individuals in large cities, environments are brought together by social media and able to gather to respond to a particular issue of concern to that population. But that is not a national or even a statewide a movement. It's specifically to urban environments. Any comment on that?
Well, that's interesting because one of the sayings that I encountered when I was in New York was that the greater the assembly, the greater the awareness, greater the awareness, greater the assembly. In short, in urban areas, a lot of people, and a lot of people who have a lot of things in common. So if you've got an Occupy group that deals with, say, the Security Exchange Commission, Occupy the SEC, and you're in New York, well, you're a few blocks from the SEC, you see, and it's easier to find. If you're out in the middle of Nebraska, what are the issues that they have out there? It's a smaller area. So in terms of what's happened to the Occupy movement is that it's scattered. And you want to say it's fragmented. Now again, one could argue that that's a problem with the Occupy movement. Well, it's all scattered, it's all here and there. Well, the Occupy movement was declared early on a terrorist sympathetic organization by the Department of Homeland Security. It was a concerted effort on the part of the United States government in collusion with local FBI offices and local police and local mayors. There was a 44 telephone conference held by the Secretary of Homeland Security laying out to the mayors of 44 cities how to disperse these people. They declared them terrorist occupiers, how to disperse them. Right. So they came into the parks, they broke it up. And as one of the people that I interviewed out in New York when I was broadcasting for the Occupy News radio network at that time, this fellow said, that was the best thing that ever happened. And the reason why was because it spread the occupiers out of the parks, out of central locations, and like seeds in the wind, they planted them. Now, the reason you don't see Occupy on the news is one simple answer: who owns the news in America?
Well, let's back up again, because you carried me quite a ways along. Some of the questions some of the things you mentioned were specific to the questions I wanted to ask.
Oh, please.
And I appreciate the obviously we're on the same page here. The dispersal issue, I'd like to talk about it a little bit more
Sure.
later. But let's go back to the beginnings, or sort of the beginnings, if there is anything. I think you mentioned to me that there is like training available, that there is
Yes.
there is at least that much organizational center that they offer training to people who want to be involved in the Occupy movement.
Yes.
What is the gist of the idea of that kind of training? I assume it's not about politics, it's more about process?
Process. In terms of the process of consensus, Occupy members or Occupy groups do not use majority rule. And we can talk more about that if you wish down the road. That's a procedural thing. They use the consensus process. In terms of training, you're looking at how to train to be a facilitator, or what is the process of consensus. You're talking about direct action training. Non-aggressive or passive-aggressive, there's different levels of training in terms of how you go to a direct action, what is involved in a direct action, and how you confront that.
By direct action, you mean like focusing on an institution like
No, like demonstrations.
Demonstrations?
What you do when you're out on the street,
Right.
and what happens when you're confronted by the police.
Are those demonstrations with a specific agenda?
Yes.
Or, yes. Okay.
Yes. So the other thing too, in terms of training, would be training on what issues. Mm-hmm. Everyone gravitates toward a certain issue. There are people who are anti-fracking. There's people who are anti-corporate,
Genetically modified food.
GMOs is a big one. I just came from a demonstration down in Oxnard against Monsanto. I'm sorry, Monsanto. So you pick your issue. And then like-minded people come together, and that's where the Occupy then forms into what they call working groups, affinity groups, caucuses, committees, and that's where the boots meet the ground.
So if a person was interested in participating, how would they let somebody in Occupy know that they want to be part of the group? Do they have to show up to a demonstration? Is there a site somewhere that they could contact?
There are a multitude of websites online. And most of what's happening with the Occupy movement is now being done online. There are still gatherings. I just came back from the national gathering in Sacramento here about a month and a half ago. The first of was the 1st of August, 2nd, 3rd. And so they still had gatherings, but most of it's now being done through social media, through Facebook. So if you wanted to look at a particular issue, you would go online. And there are conference calls that are held weekly in a number of Occupy groups, online chat rooms that are devoted to it. There is online talk show. So, and there are dozens, and I mean dozens, of at least 400 that I'm aware of, 400 Occupy-related websites that are out there.
You mentioned the dispersal from the parks.
Yes.
That the governors and the mayors and the federal government apparently had coordinated. You were involved specifically in the most famous one, Zucotti Park.
I was there.
And that lasted for how long?
Well, they first moved into Zucotti Park on the 17th, 18th or so of September. It was really a peaceful demonstration. It was called by a group called Adbusters, which is out of Canada. And they were a bunch of kids got together on a Saturday afternoon in costumes, dressed up like clowns and Uncle Sam's and whatnot. And they went down to the financial district. And by the way, the financial district is closed on Saturday. And there were about 150, 200-ish, depends on who you talk to. And they went down, and the police were ordered to go in and break them up because they were disrupting traffic.
This was a Saturday in Wall Street. I've been there on weekends, and I know it's empty.
You could shoot a gun off.
Yeah, it's empty.
And it's empty. So the idea, the hypocrisy of going down there, it had been reasonably well organized.
Well, I don't want to get into the
whole
thing. But
so then what happened
how long
was
were they there?
They moved into Zucotti Park, which is a park, a half-acre park over in front of the Bank of America on Broadway and Trinity Street and Pine or whatever it is. And they took tents and they took sleeping bags and they went into this park. And by the way, when you say a park, it is it's a granite slab with some trees. That was around the 18th, 19th of September. What really set it off was the pepper spray incident. So then by the 20th of September, you now had 1,000 or more people in that park. By the time I arrived, October 1st, and there were over 5,000 people now in that park. And I was there throughout the month of October into November. The park was dispersed. They attempted to disperse the park on October 25th, and that failed. And I wrote an article about that. You can read that in The Independent. And then they returned a month later, and they came in at 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, they knew that something was going on because for days before the dispersal, emergency vehicles would drive through during the day and blare their horns. And we did a scouting trip, and then they came in.
We understand that they were going to do, the powers that be would like to clean this park out.
And they did.
They move them, and they did, and they had whatever stratagems they used.
They were brutal.
How many people would you say were there at the end as part of the Occupy movement?
Oh, wow, gosh, and it depended on what time of the, honestly, it depended on what time of the day you were there. If you were there,
500?
Oh, at 1 o'clock in the morning, there might have been 3,000 maybe.
Really?
Yeah.
So this is what I was getting to, is that these Occupy movements sort of emulate, or one another, I'm not quite sure, but this Occupy parks, Occupy Tahrir Square, Occupy centers of attention by the general public as a movement that seems to be been pretty effective in many parts of the world. It worked in Egypt for the first part.
I trained, in fact, I trained the facilitators of Occupy Egypt that are now in Cairo, and were there at Tahrir Square.
To a degree, it almost worked in Turkey, or at least there's been some progress.
Some progress there. I trained the facilitators that are now in Occupy Paris. And
in Europe, the country, there's a lot more street demonstration, more more
Yes.
willingness to be part
Yes.
of the public
Yes.
display than there is in this country.
But look at the change in language. The last presidential election, you had candidates that were talking about the 99%.
That's true. Well, I'll get into the 1% thing a little bit here.
Right,
But what I'm trying to get is why do you think that, to some appearances, the consequences of the Occupy efforts in this country over the last several years have not specifically generated a change in administration or politics or law? Do you think that's true or not true?
Oh, gosh. Have they had any?
Not dialogue, I'm talking about the actual change.
No. No. The powers that control our government, the powers that control our corporate powers, that control our media, they control what we eat, what we think, what we watch on television, they control our government. These are entrenched powers.
Yeah.
Occupy is a revolutionary movement in the fact that it's a nonviolent movement, and there was the black movement within the movement, and there was a real struggle there for a while in New York, because you mentioned the anarchists. It's funny thing about the anarchists is that the first rule of anarchy is there are no rules, and we used to just laugh at the anarchists because they would try to break things up. But there was a black bloc, what they called the black bloc within the movement, and the black bloc wanted violence. They realized that to make change, there was have to be revolution.
That's an argument, yeah.
Right, and the Occupy movement said, look, we're non-violent. We follow the tenets of, say, the Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. It has to be passive resistance, and it has to be non-violent. Has there been a change in our national government? No. Has there been change on certain local level governments? Yes.
That's true. We see things like in Seattle.
Yes, absolutely.
Or San Diego even.
More socialist candidates are emerging out of it, occupiers that are now running for political office.
But, I mean, we talked about the 1%, so we'll get into that. I mean, that was sort of the battle cry of the movement.
Yeah.
The 1% versus the rest of us.
Yes.
The actual income disparity captured by the idea of the 1%. 1% of the public has X percentage of the wealth.
That's right.
Is actually increased.
Yes.
In the last 5 or 6 years.
It's doubled. And in fact, now we're on the issue that I focus on primarily, economic inequality.
It's gotten worse?
It's gotten worse. The economic inequality has gotten worse.
Let me just give you a number here. The bottom 9/10 of, it's the top 1% of the 1% is one of the interesting figures.
That is correct.
The top 1% has more than half of the wealth of all of America together.
It's more than that now.
Yeah. Well, this is New York Times, July of 2014. The richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. But the bottom 9/10 of the 1% have been about the same. They've held about their same percentage. So of the top 1%, 90% of that are sort of holding on to their wealth and their affluence. But the top 1%, in other words, the 1% of the 1%, have gotten almost all the growth gains in terms of the wealth of the very rich over the last few years.
Yeah.
The top 1% hold 40% of U.S. wealth, and the top 1% of the 1% hold 21.5% of U.S. wealth.
Well, the numbers that I have are slightly different in the fact that if you divide the economy, if you divide the population into quantiles of 20%, 20, 40, 60, 80, whatever, the bottom 20% has a negative wealth because of debt. The bottom 40% has no wealth. The bottom 60% has 2% of the wealth, and the bottom 80% have 6% of the wealth. So if you look at the top 20%, there's wealth there, but the real wealth is in the hands of 1/2 of 1%. And
these are stunning numbers. Another big number.
Well, this is going to be the death of America.
Okay, well, of the world. I have a figure here that says the top 85 wealthiest people in the world.
In the world.
Top 85 in the world have as much worth as 3.5 billion
people
on the bottom up.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so these numbers are compelling, and awful, and I think touch the emotional, intellectual, and soul of most people who hear them. But why are we not changing, and why is the Occupy movement or whatever, somebody, not moving a population to act on these subjects?
Because things aren't desperate enough. It's desperate, but it's not desperate enough. When you have a population that is absolutely frozen in despair and fear over their possible loss of their jobs. Unemployment has not gotten better. It's actually stagnating. In fact, that they're claiming, so when you have a population, of 80, 85, 90% of your population is scared to death of losing their job, of not being able to keep their kids in school, not being able to feed their children, pay their mortgage. These are people who are not going to get out of their houses and drive over to the local park and join an Occupy group that are in a park or meeting somewhere over here, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have the time. We know that when things get so bad that you have a rising unemployment rate, you have a rising homelessness rate. If you think that the homelessness issue has gone away, we're still losing a minimum of 17,000 families a month in this country are still losing their homes. Now, what happens when you have 50 million, 60 million, 90 million, 120 million people who are either unemployed or underemployed, homeless or damn near homeless, and their desperation now goes beyond, I got to get in the car, I got to get to work, I got to kiss my boss's ass, I can't, and I got to pay my credit card bill, and when you have a population along 50 million, 60 million that are beyond desperate, then they don't care anymore. And then they become violent. The Occupy movement knows this, and they know that it's not going to change until things get so bad. And the way things are going, they're getting worse. I believe, it's not the movement, but I believe from my research, my studies, and what I've been doing for the last several years, the biggest problem facing this country today is the economic inequality. The wealthy have strip mined out of this country over the last 50 years. They have strip mined, this is according to the Economist, somewhere between 22 and $40 trillion have been strip mined and parked in offshore accounts.
Well, and so, I mean, we know this divergence is so upsetting and so awesome and so obvious to anybody who spends a moment, but the rest, it seems that the general public
is numb
to this, and they are focused on, as you say, some of the life issues.
Yes.
But there's also an attempt to do some things that maybe would be called palliative, if you're being cynical. Let's talk a little bit about the efforts to raise the minimum wage. Do you think that's maybe using the argument you were making that people have to be so harmed that they will not rise up in some big change? If you just give people a decent, a basic minimal salary, that will keep them from the changes that are necessary.
But look at the backlash. Look at the backlash that you saw in Congress. Look at the backlash that the billionaires put out there the moment they said, my God, do you realize in terms of rates of inflation, if minimum wage had stayed with rates of inflation, there wouldn't be any debate about a $15 minimum wage because it would already be there.
I know.
So,
but my point I'm trying to say is, you think from a political social change point of view, should we just let the free markets keep the wages down to a point where everybody just is so angry and breaks and fights, or should we try to organize, recreate the union movement, raise salaries up to at least a quantity that a person at a minimum wage job could have an apartment and a house or a car, or which is better? Is it better to try to make these slightly mobile upward changes, or is it better to just let the beast break itself?
That's a really good question, and from a standpoint of view of an activist who wants to achieve some kind of parity or some kind of equality peacefully, then I would say, the occupiers should be out on the streets, and they should be marching in front of McDonald's, they should be going to Congress, they should be doing. Most people can't do that because they're not making a livable wage. Secondly, the occupiers that I encounter in the last couple of years, most of them believe that, the beast is going to win. The beast is going to win. So what occupiers are doing is occupiers are spending a lot of time developing neighborhood and community self-contained units. Occupy Santa Barbara, for example, evolved, left De La Guerra Plaza, moved over onto one side of Santa Barbara, and now are living, growing their own food, dumpster diving and growing their own food. They've done a lot of what the 20-somethings have done today, which is they've checked out. They feel as if they really have no impact on the national scene, but the day's coming when it's all going to go. And that's when they're preparing for that sort of what I call the Occupy apocalypse. And then they're prepared because their neighborhoods are growing food. There's a big movement going on in Ventura where the food banks are literally going into empty lots. They're doing it in Detroit now. They're doing it in Portland. Occupiers are growing food in empty lots that have been abandoned.
Well, this is not unlike the. I'm not trying to. I sounded dismissive when I said it.
I don't.
Dismissive.
Yeah.
It's not unlike the quote-unquote hippie movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in which people would drop out.
Absolutely.
And go and take care of their family.
Right.
Take care of their own self-sustained.
Right.
They'd have wind farm, or they'd have a wind machine or something to make energy. They would take care of it. And I would make fun of that. I mean, I have to admit that I didn't make fun, but I certainly was, whimsical about it. But if you, I go up to that Mendocino coast every once in a while. And there are people who actually have lived that way for 50 and 60 and 70 years.
Yes.
In Idaho and Oregon, I've been up in those countries, and you see people still who actually have survived in that mode. They're outside the huge pressure population areas, but they're surviving. So it's interesting to wonder if they could do it again with the burden of overwhelming population pressures. But it's a nice idea, and I hope it works. We're getting down toward the end, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about Radio Occupy, a show that you do on KCSB.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, Radio Occupy was an affinity group of four of us who realized that what we could do is we put together a radio show. We went through the training and we created Radio Occupy, and we program out of KCSB at the University of California, Santa Barbara. We are one of at least more than 24 shows just like that in America. From coast to coast, there are Occupy Radio, Radio Occupy, Occupy Radio, such and such, at least 24 that I know of around the country, and that's where those small groups of occupiers came together and said, how do we make a change? How do we make a difference?
So if a person goes on, they can find Radio Occupy or Occupy UCSB or...
Yeah, Radio Occupy Santa Barbara. Go online, we're at 91.9 on the FM dial. We broadcast Tuesday nights from 7 to 8.
Okay.
And we focus on...
We're going to end up here now. So
okay.
I want to say goodbye to the crew, Allie and Tess and Juanita and everybody who's made the show possible. We'll be doing another show soon. And